I always envision disclosure as what you said, like coming forward and being like, these are the Carblaxians from Zebel Ganubi, and this is what they do, et cetera, et cetera. Everything we know or speculate. And I think that the goal in some circles of the disclosure movement all along was just to get people to the same point with UFOs that people are now with the Kennedy assassination, right?
Yeah.
To say, hey, I don't know what it is, but we aren't being told the story. Something strange is definitely going on. And in that regard, I got to admit, it's a success.
This week's guest is Mr. Joshua Cutchin, author and musician, husband and father, North Carolina born, Wisconsin educated, now living in Georgia. Mr. Cutchin left a career in public affairs at the University of Georgia to pursue his passion for writing and music full-time. But since then, he's authored 7 critically acclaimed books on the paranormal and high strangeness, appeared on shows like Coast to Coast AM, Ancient Aliens, and has spoken at conferences across the country. Welcome to the show, Josh. Also appearing in this episode is Mr. Jason McLean. He's an artist, a paranormal researcher, and one of the nicest people I've met during my podcast journey. During this episode, we talk about the recent alien disclosure, the end times, and of course, we dive into some Bigfoot research. Guys, y'all, whoever's listening, this episode's for everyone who loves a good paranormal story. We went nearly 2 hours, had to trim some of it off. This was an amazing episode. I had a hard time naming it. I named it Aliens in the End Times, but it goes into so much more. If you want a good paranormal, kind of biblically adjacent alien disclosure show, this is for you. You won't be disappointed. It goes deep. Halfway through the show, I forget that I'm actually hosting. I ended up just listening to these two brain trusts just talk about it and debate it, and it is amazing. I had more fun watching this show than probably you will. I hate to say that, but I love doing podcasts, and I was on my own podcast watching a podcast. So enjoy this episode. This is the Caffeinated Cryptid podcast, combining incredible scientific perspectives with captivating stories from those who have experienced high strangeness in real life. Bigfoot witnesses, paranormal researchers, and everything in between. Hello, I'm Bobby Dizzle, and I'm the host of the Caffeinated Cryptid. I've heard dozens, if not hundreds, of real-life paranormal accounts of Bigfoot witnesses, and I've talked to several scientists on paranormal adjacent subjects, and I'm just in here to hear the stories, to sit cross-legged on the floor and enjoy it as much as you are. So let's get to the episode.
By the way, the only reason I'm here is because Bob was like, "Hey, I got Josh coming on. You want to come make it even sexier?" I'm like, "Well, yeah."
Oh God,
we're gonna have neck beards and facial hair everywhere.
That's not the way negative numbers work, Bobby. They subtract. They don't add.
Let me adjust that here. Okay, but yeah, no, it's like
it's the cheerleader effect, man.
Yeah,
precisely. But yeah, no, really most of my work was originally in eschatology and creationism and all that. And so I've done a lot of work on that. People are like, "So is it going to be?" I'm like, "No, stop. It's not. That won't happen now." They're like, "Oh, so we're okay." I'm like, "I did not say that at all. Lots of bad things happen. That doesn't mean it's the end of the world." I'm not saying it's like it ain't that far away. Don't get me wrong. That having been said, we could absolutely get vaporized and not have it be within that final 7 years. Like, don't get it twisted.
Yeah, that's
bad things happen.
Yeah, that's the thing I told some family members recently. I'm like, you realize that like the second coming is the best case scenario because they're all in like, it's the end times. I'm like, yeah, I hope that's what it is because otherwise it's just living through shit.
I keep waiting on some blue beam to happen anytime. Just a united we stand us with some fake aliens.
Well, I'll have to admit, and if you want to talk about this I don't even know what we're talking about tonight. I was like, Josh is going to be here. I got it.
I started recording before y'all showed up. I'll just start it wherever the conversation looks good. Whatever.
You're not going to do a proper introduction. Is that what I'm hearing?
No, that's the best podcast, man. It's just like it starts like we talking about a floodplain. Yeah, I don't even know what the hell they're talking about.
I just realized it says recording, and I'm like,
yeah, it's been recording since 6:30.
Yep.
I've been doing that for like 2 months now, and it's had the best episode, so I'm sticking with it.
Well, anyway, so where were we before I got distracted?
Vaporization.
Oh, vaporization. Yeah, that sounds unpleasant. Yeah, I mean that's it. Okay, yeah. The thing that surprised, honestly, the thing that surprised me, like a lot of my stuff I wrote back in 2014 on like a lot of the stuff that's happening, and the thing that surprised me the most is I really thought they were going to be a lot more dedicated to the nuts and bolts UFO stuff. I did not see how direct they're going with the interdimensional stuff. Like I figured it'd be like, okay, so yeah, here's some material, aliens over here, but if you take the DMT, you can commune with our space brethren. I figured they'd put a lot more veil over it and a lot more razzle dazzle kind of stuff.
Yeah,
I did not see them coming out being this sort of in your face with it.
I have some friends who just weren't surprised by it. They're like, it always falls back to a position of spiritual warfare every time this comes up, and I'm like, yeah, I guess it kind of does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they haven't even craft hasn't been a thing they talked about.
Yeah,
it's just been like special beings and frequencies and light.
Well, when you get people on, the floor of Congress saying interdimensional, like the gloves are off, There's no putting that toothpaste back in the tube, right?
Right, exactly. Well, and look at all the Satanism stuff that's literally just there now, where it's like, yeah, hey, this is all Satan, and we we're all cool with demons. And I was noticing the other, actually I say the other day, but I'm getting old, so it's probably been a lot longer than that. How many like superheroes and fantasy heroes and all this have what are overtly demonic symbols on them or as a part of them, right? Like, don't get me wrong, I grew up with Nightcrawler, and with the exception of the tail, there's really nothing about him that's overtly demonic, and that's sort of the whole point is don't judge a book by its cover, right? Because he's a devout Catholic, but by and large he looks like an elf. But now it's like, hey, these got these characters with horns and they have satanic powers, which again, don't get me wrong, there's always been like the Ghost Rider and Son of Satan and all that, Spawn. But it's like the last few years, like there's a lot of these characters who are just straight up obviously demonic, and that's even part of their spiel, and it's so prevalent that I'm just shocked that they went as overt as they've gone. That's my only point.
Actually, this is kind of an interesting question that I'll ask both of you, although since you broached the topic, Jason, I'd be eager to hear your input. This is a point of departure with me and a lot of the synchromistic crowd, because they'll say, oh, look at this symbol. It's a symbol of the Black Lodge, or this symbol is a satanic symbol, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea, at least in a lot of those cases, is that there's someone behind the strings pulling the, encouraging graphic designers, I guess, to incorporate those things. But to me, that's the less enchanted view of the world. For me, it's more, dealing as I do in the realm of archetypes and symbols that have power, it feels much more likely and much more mystical for those to be natural sort of bubblings up of archetypes rather than deliberate insertions. How do you feel about that?
I love the fact that Bob is the host of this show, and we're basically doing the intro. You're the guest. I was just here to be
like a wrecking ball.
Yeah.
Well, nice to meet you, Bob. I mean,
hey, we've met before, actually, over on Glenn's podcast.
That's right.
Paranormal guys.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. I do so many of these. Sorry, sometimes
that's okay.
A little bit. Yeah.
Josh, trust me. Don't apologize. It's like, well, I'm going to do a podcast with another white guy with a long beard. I mean, let's be honest.
We're probably going to get sued for having 3 people with beards on here.
Yeah.
It's got to be some kind of trademark somewhere.
But yeah, back to your point. I tend to agree with that. I don't. So yes, are there people who are deliberately going about and inserting religion? Yeah, I mean that's obviously the case. Is that the vast majority? No, I do not think that's the vast majority.
No.
So part of me. So where I would maybe split a hair here with you, and it's not even a disagreement, it's just splitting a hair. I think it is part of, spirit of the age, zeitgeist kind of a thing, because I do think that's I think that tends to be far more prevalent than what people realize. However, I do also think that that's both a supernatural thing, but then also just a cultural expression, right? And they feed into each other as our culture has embraced the idea of the demonic anti-hero, right? Like a Ghost Rider or the Son of Satan from Marvel,
or Hellboy. I mean,
or Hellboy. Yeah, no, straight up Hellboy.
I adore Hellboy, so I
dude, I am
discharged, but
I am a huge Mike Mignola fan, like straight up. So yeah, they don't even like we can talk about that for an hour. Bore everyone to tears. So yeah, no, I think as the culture has embraced this idea of the demonic anti-hero who's really fighting the good fight, I think that's absolutely become part of the culture,
right?
And of course there's also I get to stick my finger in the eye of Christians. I think there's that motivation also with some graphic designers and some people. I don't think it's one thing, right? Sorry, there you go. One thing. I don't think it's one thing. I think it's multiple things. But like you, I don't think it's as much there is, some warlock in the back telling everyone to do that. Again, some cases, 100%. But I think vast majority is spirit of the age kind of stuff. And culture.
Well, there's sort of a reciprocal Ouroboros thing going on here. And, I've had this conversation a couple of times today, actually, that I think that the reason that consensus is fraying and the future feels more uncertain than ever, and the fact that we are having, I'll admit it, like one of the better UFO disclosures on record, is all tied into the fact that it's trickster time. It's that sort
blue
of
beam, baby.
Well, it's the time. It's that liminal time when, like, I don't think that you could have had those hearings if it wasn't this point in the timeline.
Everybody was distracted elsewhere. They're just like, hey, look, what about this?
Right,
we got aliens too.
And I kind of get the appeal of that demonic I mean, obviously because I love Hellboy, but like the idea of again, you can feel free to split my hairs on this too, but the idea of Lucifer as beloved and then being cast out is a very romantic and appealing idea in a lot of ways. Like,
it's got that Joker archetype to it.
Yeah, and it's this idea of like I was loyal, even though he wasn't. I was loyal to you, and now you're turning your back on me and exact my vengeance, etc., etc.
People love the Joker archetype.
Well, so okay. I want to come back to something you said, because that's where I think, again, not really pushback, but maybe a slightly different perspective.
No, I mean, this is conversation.
But I want to come back to your point about disclosure, because I think I have a slightly different take on it. But I want to stay on that point of the fallen and sort of that appeal. I was noticing, I had just listened to another podcast, and they were talking about how we're a culture that no longer has heroes, right? The way that Disney has just destroyed Luke Skywalker and Han Solo and Indiana Jones and all this.
Every legacy sequel has to have the protagonist come back broken.
Yeah. Exactly. So and they were talking about how we live in this world without heroes. And then I went to go see a movie, and I saw the trailer for Wicked, right? And I knew Wicked was a thing. I've never seen the play. I don't care. But it was just one of those things where I was thinking about it and just how often now we're not just a culture without heroes, we're a culture without villains, because even the villains are sympathetic. And I really started thinking about that, because there is, sympathy for the devil perspective is valid to a point, but if you don't have heroes and you don't have villains, then the problem is the villains get to be the good guy in those stories, and how alluring that is to people.
Well, I've said this before. I am a big fan of deconstructive storylines. I think Watchmen is literally genius. I've enjoyed The Boys. I always love things that sort of reverse engineer and take things apart. But when that's all that you're being fed, you sort of lose the point of the deconstruction, right?
It's mainstream now.
Yeah, and there's something so powerful about those archetypes. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't necessarily need to see another knight save a princess. But at the same time, like, there's something that's so archetypal about that story that it's a context that we have to retain in some form or fashion. I'm not saying all media should be like that, but I'm saying that when the pendulum swings so far in the other direction, everything tends to lose its meaning.
You think that Nolan started that trend with like the Dark Knight series? Because that was like the first.
Oh no, not at all.
It was before that.
Well,
Watchmen was older.
Well, okay. So again, okay. The whole the deconstructive narrative from coming out of literature, it really comes out of this sort of neo-Marxist work in the 60s, right? It's not that it's necessarily invalid. To Josh's point, again, love Watchmen. I've got all the versions of Watchmen. I don't like the new stuff, but I have the full version of the movie. If you haven't seen that, it's amazing.
You have that like mega cut with Tales from the Black Freighter anime in there?
Yes, I do.
Great. Yeah.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
So, again, V for Vendetta, the actual comic.
You said actually.
Yeah. Well, actually. So that's where it's coming out of. So it's not that the Dark Knight sort of starts that, but it's very much carries that theme of the deconstruction, which had been popping up in a lot of, and really the entire you could argue the entire anti-hero movement from the late 80s, early 90s is a form of deconstruction, because these are not true heroes in the sense, right? They're not people who chose to do good because it's something bad has happened to them, and so in many ways it's just a circulation of violence, right? Steve Ditko very famously does like this 5-minute. It's one of the few things where he was even recorded at all. If you don't know, Steve Ditko, for the listeners who don't know, Steve Ditko was the co-creator of Spider-Man, and he was very sort of secretive about his life. Like, there's no photograph of him post 1960 something. Like, it's like home dude read Ayn Rand, and he was like, that's my life. But he has this really interesting 5-minute spiel you can find on pretty much on YouTube, talking about why he created the character. I just forgot the name of it. It's irrelevant. But anyway, he's talking about his reaction to the heroes of the 90s being these anti-heroes. And he's like, art is about trying to show you what man can be. History is what's supposed to tell you what man was and what he is. But art is to point you to what can be. And his whole point was, we have an entire culture in the comic world where it was anti-heroes and people who were full of power, but they had their morality was lesser. They couldn't solve their own problems. And that his broader fear was, again, sort of where we are now, to your point, there should be deconstruction. We do need satire. We need somebody pushing back. There does need to be the court jester saying, okay, let's poke holes at this and see what sticks. The problem is when the entire thing is deconstruction, then you've destroyed. Then what you've done is you've destroyed a culture, because now there's no one saying, hey, you can be that. You can be the hero. You can just choose to do the right thing. You don't necessarily need to have this ulterior motive. You don't need to be down in the dirt. You can be good, because we need people to be good.
It's a lot to chew on there.
Yeah.
It's to bring it back to the more interesting point of how much of this is supernatural, how much of this is natural. Like you said, it's an Ouroboros. It is the snake eating the tail. I don't think that's a line that can really be separated. Like, what's the line between the supernatural and the psychological? I don't know that line is as hard and thick and fast as we'd like it to be.
Yeah.
Supernatural can take advantage of the psychological easily. The weak.
Well, and fold in imagination into that too, And that's, this is something that Whitley said, we need better fictions. Because they sort of bushwhack the path through the jungle of reality that we aren't willing to take, and then we just fall into those paths and go on our merry way. I don't think there's another way to explain the materialization of so many dystopias at once. You were going to say something else about disclosure.
Oh yeah, thank you, Bob. It's your
Circle back.
podcast. Start podcasting here, man.
This is a great podcast. I'm glad y'all had me on. But, it's nice to be here tonight. No, I'm not going to stop a train when it's going. But I was going to ask earlier. You mentioned this was the best disclosure we've had in a long time. What was the first little bit of disclosure besides Blue Book, maybe? I mean, I'm only 41 as of yesterday, and I don't really remember disclosure other than recently.
Well, it's been cyclical in fits and starts. I think there's probably been at least 2 since I've been involved in the past 10 years. But I mean, I think that I tend to my definition and window for a disclosure season is probably narrower. I think some people would say that the hearings last year were the culmination of what started in 2017, but I kind of view 2017 as a little disclosure season in and of itself because it kind of reached a fever pitch and then it went down and then it all sort of came back with the Grush stuff. So I think if you sort of narrow your definition, it's been happening a lot. I mean, you've kind of got the Kehoe stuff going all the way back to him saying he's going to disclose stuff on the air, and so I think that there have been plenty of them if you look at it in that sense.
Well, and even just to reiterate your point, even though it doesn't sound like it to us, Heiser pointed out, like in 1998 when they came out and said, "Oh, yeah, Roswell happened, but it was training dummies that people saw, and it was this specialized weather balloon and all that, right?" And the reason that baked Heiser's cookie was because the answer for, hey, these dummies that you're saying is what people saw, right? Not the aliens. That didn't happen until like the 50s, like almost 10 years later. And the general's response was, well, it's compressed time. And that didn't work. And that didn't, as a psychological term. And Heiser himself was like, that made absolutely no sense as an answer. And he said, the reason it made no sense wasn't the idiocy of the statement. It was, if you're going to lie, come up with a better lie. These are people who have access to tens of billions of dollars of psychological operations research. They would have had a better lie. His thought was the entire point of the lie was to get people to go, well, that didn't make sense.
Yeah, I was about to say, unless the gaslighting is the point,
Right, exactly.
Gas, 1 in a million shot.
Right, exactly. It's the sort of ludicrous nature of the answer was the point, because it was designed to make you not trust it. To your point, the gaslighting is because what they wanted people to do very slowly over time. To your point, the reason that this whole disclosure thing sort of comes in fits and starts is because it's acclamation to a concept, right? That's why I think Josh is completely correct that there are seasons of disclosure. I would include like the X-Files, things like that. We know that CIA they work with Hollywood pretty closely. They'll throw little things in there. I think the reason for this sort of fit and start is you sort of reveal something, you get people thinking, but then you back off and let it normalize and let people become accustomed to that idea.
It's like the king. It's like the king who drank a little bit of poison every day.
Yeah, no, it is. Those people who poison someone slowly over time. I think that's a great metaphor. So this is where my common disclosure, where I would push back, is I think even the word disclosure is maybe a misnomer, because people would say, "Oh, disclosure means they're releasing what they know," and that's where I would point, like, I don't think they're disclosing what they know. They're disclosing the story they want us to know.
Well, it's
what they want us to believe.
And I've had to eat a lot of crow in the past probably year or so, because I've come to know some people in that movement a little bit better, and I think that you're right. It was never so much about disclosure as it was about forcing a hand or causing a crack. You know what I mean? And the analogy that I've been using is that, like, I always envision disclosure as what you said, like coming forward and being like, these are the Carblaxians from Zebel Ganubi, and this is what they do, et cetera, et cetera. Everything we know or speculate. And I think that the goal in some circles of the disclosure movement all along was just to get people to the same point with UFOs that people are now with the Kennedy assassination, right?
Yeah.
To say, hey, I don't know what it is, but we aren't being told the story. Something strange is definitely going on. And in that regard, I got to admit, it's a success. Like the church, the church that I like, as you know, There, I am hesitant when asked at church about what I do to bring this up at all, because there's so many misconceptions about what I believe, and people have their own opinions about these phenomena, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the question is, since I've been going to my current church for the past 4 years, the question has obviously come up, and every single time I reluctantly admit what I do and what my interests are, it's always an open, interested response. It's no longer this shuttered, no longer this shuttered rejection that you used to get. I know
you can talk about it at work now. And everybody's like, my grandma lived in a haunted house and some shit like that.
Oh, yeah.
Well, back in 2020, after I got out of rehab and I was doing my aftercare and stuff as I was alcoholic, I'll never forget, it came up and somebody asks about, what I do. And I'm like, oh God, I've got to do this whole explanation, because they're going to think I mean aliens. And so I don't want to have this conversation right now. And I say, and one of the therapists there was like, oh, I think they're interdimensional. And I'm like,
yeah,
what? And the way that's pre-hearing,
Oh yeah.
So the way that meme has sort of disseminated is striking.
Yeah. No, I have not the rehab part, but a similar story about how things sort of happened at a church I used to go to a long time ago, the church I grew up in. When I sort of came out as doing this stuff more publicly, people knew I was into creationism, and I was a creationist advocate, which was okay with the church. It was actually pretty okay with it, and they were involved with the Creation Evidence Museum out in Glenrose, and they knew my work in eschatology. That also sort of got me a little on some people's radars as a little weird, because I'm my interpretations of some things is not was not necessarily the same, but people gave me some leeway on that, right? But as soon as people knew that I knew what the Nephilim were, and that I had been studying this stuff for a long time, and the adults, a lot of them were like, but the kids, your teenagers, they were like, okay, can you tell me what this stuff is? And what's funny is I'll be very, very vague here, but there were adults in positions of power who would agree with me on certain claims and certain thoughts, but they didn't want to talk about it in public. It's we don't want to be known as the church that believes in UFOs, right? And they don't want to, and it was we'll talk about this behind closed door stuff, but we don't want to be public about it. But the people in the church itself wanted to know more about it. I went to a homeless shelter in Dallas. This is just before COVID broke out. And there was a guy who went before me, preaching, and then I was going to wrap it up. And I said, introduce me as a biblical paranormal researcher. Well, he doesn't do that. And so I go up there and I make it, I do a very, very short sermon. And then it's like, okay, let me open up for questions, because I like interaction. I like questions, conversations. The very first question was about ancient astronaut theory. And I just stopped and I looked at my friend, and his jaw had dropped. He's like, what is going on here? As soon as I mentioned that, at that point, I was like, well, I'm a biblical paranormal researcher. Everyone in the room shot up and was like, oh, wait, he's got an answer for this stuff. And they had to cut it short so they could serve dinner, because they were asking all of these questions. So, yeah, I mean, to Josh's point, very simple. It's like there's been a change over the last few years where people are starting to have those conversations and questions more freely.
And this just popped into my mind, and I'm interested to hear y'all's take on this. There was a time when, a Sicilian grandmother would see no contradiction in going to mass and then coming home and doing folk magic for, and maybe even invoking the devil, the devil being the master of this world,
Yeah.
Is that kind of like the dichotomy that we're seeing now, where there's this sort of bifurcated thinking? I have my religion here, but I'm also really interested in this UFO stuff and ancient astronauts and all this other. Is that a sort of a development of that? I wonder.
I think we're allowed to think about. Sorry, we're getting more open now to think about things. You don't have to pick between each of them. You can cautiously meander into both. I'm Catholic. I'm Knights of Columbus, and I'll talk about Bigfoot while I'm cooking pancakes. and and one guy said they're all demonic. I mean, it's all, but the rest of them are like, what? And it's fun, but you know that you don't have to sacrifice one to believe the other. I mean, you don't want to go, killing your firstborn on an altar or anything.
Right.
Well, sacrificing sheep, but
it's like I tell my wife, like I think that Christians should know a lot about occultism, so they can
know your
recognize things and to know when they're stepping into stuff. And I do,
Yep.
but I keep it at arm's length, in a lot of regards.
Which we should, but I'm with you on that. I think I have, I say recently, but I'm getting older, so it's probably a lot longer ago than I would like.
42 years, Jason.
Sure, we'll go with that. Where I think that a lot of Christians have gotten in trouble because they don't know where the lines are or what the lines even mean. In fact, I would even suggest they don't really know what the lines are, meaning that there are even lines. And to your point, I think we are going back. We're starting to go back to that point where, like you said, if you were an Irishman living 300 years ago, there was no distinction in your mind between, that the Fae were, or the good neighbors were, weren't a thing, but you would still be a good Irish Catholic, or, if you were one of the Protestants who didn't manage to get beat up, whatever, but you would still recognize the little people or the good neighbors were a thing, and you worked with that. So it wasn't necessarily seen as opposites or one didn't agree with the other. In fact, really up until very recently, even really post World War I, a lot of folk ideas and interactions with the supernatural were very commonly held. So I think you're right in that observation.
I mean, I would even probably say up to World War II, because you've got that sort of explosion of spiritualism following World War I too.
Oh yeah, no, and that's fair. I tend to point to World War I because really it's only for this reason. You can find even academic papers on things that would be considered anathema today, like creationism and all of that. And then, but really post World War I, though, really it's earlier than that.
With that. Yeah.
But it's like that's sort of like when it takes over, and it does take time to filter down. So you're right.
Chased out of the academy, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What about that gateway process from the CIA from like 83? Like, how did that slip through? I'm talking about, like, it's the world as a hologram, manifestations real, near-death experiences, out-of-body experience.
So that would be the people who.
Well,
that's not the same vein, but
that's one of those millionaires don't believe in astrology, billionaires do kind of.
That's where I'm going, because that paper, that famous paper from the FBI, about UFOs that came out in 1947, it finally came out. The thing that surprises me the most is at the very, very end of it, it says this was obtained through supernatural means. All the information about the UFOs coming from, and it's so I mean, to Josh's point, there's what's allowed to be spoken to the layman, and then there's the sort of the upper, millionaires don't, but billionaires do kind of thing, right? I love that's a great. I'm going to steal that from you, by the way.
I think it's the John Jacob Asterism or something.
That would probably,
it's a good one. I'll tell you that.
It's a good one. I'll steal it. Well, so that's the whole point, right? That's always been there. The people who were, because again, World War II. The Nazis were deeply into the occult, and they got results. So the occult's always been there, and the people in the know have been like, okay, this is a real thing. We'll interact with it. But then what's for the plebeians is don't worry, which is why I kind of think there's actually a bit of a sinister underbelly to all of that, to the push of there's no such thing as magic. There's no such thing as the supernatural that's been pushed to the average person for the last 120, 140 years. Well, probably 160 years now. Was to not desensitize, to sever the connection. I mean, that's a tool that you don't want in the power of
a populace that has the potential to overthrow authority structures, and like that's the age-old story. That's the Roman story. It's every empire has struggled with that sort of suppression of spiritual movements, which is, I mean, to me that makes a lot more sense for UFO secrecy than there are people from other places. Oh, we got to keep that a secret. Or there are things that manifest and all this crazy stuff is real and we cannot have you getting anywhere near it.
And DMT and mushrooms are also illegal, but for no reason
that's changing.
Yeah, but it's like that's part of the link to the supernatural as well, and they try to keep that down.
So let me throw this at you. It's not necessarily that it's a link. Well, it is linked to the supernatural. I think we're seeing a change, but I don't know that the change wasn't planned a long time ago, and I don't necessarily mean by man, right? I think we have to think a lot higher when we think about governments. The spirits over the nations have been there for thousands of years. They have power. They have plans. But if you get people who don't believe in the Christians don't even believe. Most mainstream Christians barely believe in the supernatural. Well, let's be honest. I had a person who was fairly high up in the church I used to go to. When we were talking, when I sort of came out as to what I do, he asked me, he said, and this is stuck in my head. It's nothing about him. It's just because I think he represents a lot of people in mainstream Christianity. He said, so when Paul says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the powers and principalities of the air, do you think he was being literal? And the reason that sticks out in my head is because it was all I could do to not say, well, what do you think he meant? Right? It sticks in my head because I think that represents a lot of mainstream Christianity of, the supernatural is real, but it's mostly lip service. And then in practical matters, like there aren't demons and angels running around. A lot of it's psychological, right? It's all
or that boundary is fungible, right?
Right.
The psychological versus the spiritual. Like that's, I can't tell you the sort of delight that I had. My father-in-law is a Baptist minister, and his brother is a Baptist minister, and
tough crowd.
We're moving. We're moving their mother's stuff a couple of years ago, and my father-in-law's brother sits down. He's like, so he's not a pastor of a church anymore. He works for the church organization. He's like, so we had somebody who was having something in their house, and he's just like, he's trying to find the words. He's like, turns out it was used for, gun smuggling for Al Capone, because he's up in Chicago, and he's like, gun smuggling for Al Capone. And we went there and we did our best, but we saw some things. And I'll never forget just looking at him being like, sometimes it's not a metaphor. And he said, sometimes it's not a metaphor. And it was so, I mean, look, obviously I don't have ill will towards the Baptist church, but there's a certain stereotype that comes with that and keeping all this stuff at arm's length. And it goes back to the point that I made earlier. Like, you have to acknowledge that this stuff is sometimes not a metaphor.
Yeah. Well, to your point, like it's the trust me, I'll be the first one to say, because I was technically non-denominational, but it comes out of the Baptist, it comes out of the Baptist tradition. It's that the let's keep all of this at arm's length mentality is not unearned. Like they've last 100+ years of evangelical history is sort of the idea of keeping the supernatural at bay. Because there was sort of this embrace of modernity and this sort of, the people in the white coats will tell us what reality is. We'll stick to the supernatural, right? And so this is sort of the broader point that I have. I think a lot of that may have been far more malicious, because once you start understanding, like you said, it's not all metaphor. Oh, wait, there are spirits over the nations, and there is the supernatural. And this, I think a lot of people have literally hurt themselves or killed themselves or been injured by a lack of understanding about the supernatural. And if people understood, because I find that the fact that once people started saying, hey, the supernatural is real, this is all real, it's amazing how quickly a lot of the Christians started saying, well, maybe this also ties into politics in a way, that maybe what we're seeing in culture, I'm not going to get political, but people have started realizing that the stuff that we're seeing in culture and in politics is not unrelated to the supernatural, and that things are getting maybe more intense because a lot of the veil around people's eyes, where it's like, don't pay attention to this over here, that's sort of falling away and it can't be ignored anymore. Right. And so that's why a lot of these things maybe are coming out further as a way of saying, well, since we don't need to pretend we're not here, let's just go ahead and do this. So, like I said, I think the sinister part was to keep people unaware of what was going on. So they would just say, oh, it's business as usual, until it wasn't. And that maybe people woke up a little too early. So I don't necessarily think it was like, hey, let's it was like, well, people can't handle it. I think, to Josh's point, it was if they understood what was happening, they would respond very differently. Let's make certain that they're maybe blinded to what's really happening.
Yeah.
I think that pandemic opened a lot of eyes, the way everybody behaved. As far as leadership goes. It
occurs to me, and either of you can feel free to push back on this, but I think I might have even said this to you at some point, Jason. It occurs to me that so much of what we think about the other side of the veil is just early Christian fanfic,
Yeah.
And there's so much room there for a lot of different things. And
yeah.
I find someone's faith to be fragile if it's shattered by the possibility that Apollo exists in some form or fashion, because
right.
Ain't nobody saying that Apollo's greater than Yahweh. That's not embedded in my statement, but you've got to recognize that there are Apollonic forces, and things like that. And I've always found that absolutely confusing and befuddling, that there can't be, to quote a me-ism, an ecology of souls, an ecology of beings that exists with a lot of different motivations and whatnot, but all still subservient to the supreme creator, which can come in and say, stop it.
Yeah, exactly.
I've never understood that rejection.
So let me not push back, but rather
I can't push back either.
but completely agree with you, because here's the thing, I have had the exact same thought. I'll have to find something to push back on so that we can make the show more interesting, but I won't push back.
I'm pissed off. I'm just going to be like, you're crazy, Josh. Yeah. You should write a book called Ecology of Souls.
Wouldn't be the first time I've heard that I'm crazy. So
yeah. Oh, tell me about it. It wouldn't even be the first time you've heard it from me. But no, because to your point, right? I think that one of my big complaints is this lack of understanding of the supernatural has led, I think, to, again, not just the dangers of, I think a lot of people really have committed suicide because they didn't understand what was going on and how they made themselves vulnerable to the supernatural because they just didn't think it existed. Well, the snake that bites you is the one you don't see coming 9 times out of 10, right? Trust me, I'm in Texas. I know to look out for snakes, but that's the point, right? If you don't know it's there because it's camouflaged, that's the thing. That's the one that's going to bite you.
It's like that old soldier's axiom. Like the bullet that you hear is not the one that gets you.
Yeah. And so, to your point, I'm right there with you. But I also think the problem is, again, the more sinister point is of why maybe a lot of this evolved is so that we wouldn't understand what was being said. So I was part of the Hebrew roots movement 20 plus years ago, before it kind of went over the edge a little bit, right? Because it was supposed to be about understanding what the New Testament from the Old Testament perspective. Because I think one of the big mistakes that we've made in the West is we're trying to understand the Old Testament from a New Testament perspective, and it's like, well, hold on, it was written that way for a reason, right? That is supposed to tell us about what's actually happening with Jesus and what's going on. So there was a lot of exploration of that. And I noticed very quickly, there's a lot of assumptions that are going on in the New Testament that we don't have in our head because we've distanced ourselves from those things. Michael Heiser, I think, was one of the most important, scholars to have emerged over the last 50 years because of what he did. And he would even say, I'm just relating the data to everyone. That's all he said he was doing. Although I think it was a lot more important than that. But like I was 95% of the way there, then he was able to say, well, here's these other things that locked it fully into place for me, right? That's what he did. But it was really important because when you understand what the Old Testament's talking about, the divine council concepts, when you have these things in your head, you're like, oh, this makes way more sense. That, like you said, there's an ecology, right, of spirits. That the word Elohim in the Old Testament, it's not incorrect to translate it as God. The problem is how we read the word gods, right? Is that, yes, there is one Elohim, which is God, Jehovah, Yahweh, whichever one you want to go with, but that there are other Elohim underneath him. He's the Elohim. These are a plural, like it's a subservient, lesser created being things, but they're on that side of the veil. In many ways, I find a lot of this is completely off. I don't want to get us too off topic, but I find a lot of similarity.
There's a topic.
I know.
Yeah, I was about to say, what am I talking about?
Well, I don't want to get necessarily too far afield, but
is the topic in the room with us?
show me on the doll where the topic hurt you. But with the Plains Indians, with the Great Spirit and then the spirits underneath, right? And I don't think it's a coincidence. It was actually one of the, oh darn it, I just forgot his name. It wasn't Davy Crockett because he died.
Daniel Boone. General Custard.
No. It was one of the founding fathers of Texas. I think it may have been Sam Houston.
Yeah,
it may have been. Well, it may have been Sam Houston. The thing is, he did this study with Cherokee, with the Cherokee tribes at the time. He was talking to him, and he pointed out that their name for the Great Spirit in their language was Yahuwah Wahua. And he noticed, and he was like, I'm not really that. He's like, I'm not that much of a scholar, but that sounds an awful lot like, the older Paleo Hebrew version of Jehovah. So, but I think that's my point. Is I think that it's not inconsequential that the Plains Indians' view of the Great Spirit and the spirits underneath, that's very similar to what they had in their heads when they were writing the Old Testament. And it's probably a much more accurate way of viewing this thing, where it's not that God is one of them, but rather they are of that plane of existence, right? And once you have that in your head, a lot of the Old Testament makes sense. Like, why is God spending so much time? We're going through Exodus right now, and it's just the more you understand that, you have that in your head, you start looking at places and names and things. It is clear that the entirety of the Old Testament, half the time, is God saying, let me just throw some shade at these regional deities and these regional myths and all of that.
Well, and it also reframes the Old Testament God less as just jealous and more along the lines of being like, you don't trust me, you don't want to put stock in that. Like, it's a thing, but it's not what you want. It's like, it's instead of like taking a toy away from a child, it's like taking a substance away from an addict or something.
100%.
That's interesting that what was it? Yahuwah
Mahua?
Look, I'm a Texan. I've never pronounced anything correctly in my life. That's as close as I'm going to get.
Anyway,
Yahoo.
Point being that sort of open vowel sound you find across the world. You've got Ial in Greek, Ea in Mesopotamia, Eo in Polynesia, and then the Om and the Alm and sounds and Eastern traditions, and I think that ties into the idea of psyche being both breath and soul, and depending on your assessment of DMT, which I detect is not that it's a lovely thing, but like, the idea that DMT is synthesized in the lungs, perhaps there's some sort of vector, some sort of connection there, about these syllables and that sort of sound, that awe.
Yeah, I think you're onto something with that.
Do you think the pineal gland played more into it back in the day with the I can't say that.
The problem with the pineal gland idea, which I'm again very sympathetic to, is it's been really hard to isolate in DMT in the pineal gland. I recently heard that Strassman's Cottonwood Institute found it in the human pineal gland, and it's been found in rodent pineal glands, but I think it's kind of been something that's been chased after for a while, but it's so consistent. So like I think there's something to it. That body of belief didn't just arise out of nowhere. I don't think.
Yeah,
I could either like maybe the Great Spirit appeared to every culture, or there was more trade back then than we think there is, or like it was just like an ultimate radio signal via the DMT in our pineal glands. Everybody got the same download.
It's the corner that I got painted into that got me into this whole stuff in a serious way. I was looking at a Trojan Feast, and I'm looking at these Alaskan traditions of the Bequas and being given food by the Bequas, and if you take the food from the Bequas, you're trapped with the Bequas forever. They're Bigfoot analog. And I'm like, that sounds like Western European fairy folklore. And sure enough, that idea of accepting food in the other world, you'll see across the Americas, Oceania, Australia. It's not just a diaspora of the Persephone myth. Like there's something else going on there, and exactly what you said, Bobby. It's either cultural transmission from an international civilization that no one recognizes, or
giant boats we don't know about,
or the collective unconscious, or objective interaction with the spirit world. Those are the only three answers that I see, and any of those completely changes the way that we understand existence.
And there was a Dan Brown book about the pineal gland. I can't remember what it was. I think
really,
they were talking about how the substance from it was the manna they described in Exodus. That's what fed the Hebrews in the desert. And I think it was Angels and Demons book.
Angel Sand Demons.
Yeah, Angels Sand Demons.
Yeah.
So how do I say this? I'm very sympathetic to, say, a true Fortean interpretation of a lot of things, where it's like, hey, maybe our attempt to to try and find the scientific understanding for everything is in itself just another form of folklore. But I'm not a true Fortean. I do think science matters. I think it's cool. I think we can get to some things. So I'm a little iffy on the whole pineal. Again, not that it's not related to this, but I think we want to materialize way more. I think we're more comfortable with a material world than an immaterial world. And so we look for material explanations for the immaterial. And I think that can put us in some dangerous waters from time to time, because I think it blocks our perception of what's really happening. But to your point, I don't think there's three. I think there's four, and the fourth is sort of all of the above as to why we have these cults. Because again, if we take the Bible seriously, it doesn't mean that we've always properly interpreted what it means. But if we take it seriously, then there was a global culture at one point that again, that's the Tower of Babel event, right? People, they have the stories, they have these things, they all sort of have this sort of common thing. They are spread out over time, in languages and cultures, but also by the spirits themselves. God gives us humanity over to the spirits, Deuteronomy 32. And so you now have all of this going on. And I do think in the past, there was a lot more interaction over oceans. I'm of the opinion that I think there's a really, really strong argument to be made that the bronze, or at least the copper for the Bronze Age, came from the Americas.
Yeah.
So, Michigan, wasn't it?
Yeah, Michigan. Yeah. Yep.
So yes, I do think that, and there's some real reason to think that, like, not just the Chinese made it over here once or twice to the Americas, but rather that maybe what even collapsed the Mayan Empire was invasions by essentially the horse-mounted people making it over here as well. That's a whole other conversation.
Oh, yeah.
But the point is, we were a lot more this modern view that, we're the only ones who did this stuff. There's no evidence for that. It's hubris to think that. I think we were a lot more interactive than we imagine ourselves to be, or in the past. I think we did. But again, if you take the Bible seriously, we were all one family at one point. We got broken up, spread across. So we have cultural transmission from a global, but we still have interaction. But then we also have the interaction with the supernatural. So to your point, I would suggest it's not just the three options. The fourth is all of the above. And that's sort of how we get here. But it's, again, whether it's the pineal gland that allows for this or whatever, I think that in ancient times, and really even just a few hundred years ago, we were more attuned to nature because that's what we lived in. That's what we're set up for.
Yeah.
Over the last year, I've gone on this exploration of the brain a little bit, and how it works, and how much light and sound and all of this is keeping us in fight or flight. It makes us easier to control, right? We used to get up with the sun, and it's not that we went to bed when the sun went down, but we had firelight, right? And we had the moon, and those are very different frequencies than the artificial light that we sort of live in. We're sort of living in this hyper
novel
fear state,
a hyper novel world, because there are always trade-offs that we don't completely grasp. And the fact that we were created, depending on your interpretation of that, created or evolved to exist in the outside world. Every time we do something that, even things that are on their face benign, they still have trade-offs. Like, just look at the recent controversies in orthodontia. Idea that we didn't have as many horrible, tooth problems when we were eating raw vegetables all the time. No one's going to sit here and say, don't cook your vegetables, don't boil your vegetables, that's bad for you. No one's going to say that, because it's not. But there are trade-offs involved with something like that.
Could it be that we just didn't have a lot of candy back then too? I mean, causation, correlation.
That is a thing. That there was, I think cavities are exceedingly rare in Neanderthal remains.
Yeah. Well, it's any really it's any culture that does not have agriculture. You basically have no real dental issue. It's far less. Let me say it that way. It's far less. You can almost always pinpoint when a culture has advanced to agriculture because of the presence of cavities. Because it's not just sugars and candies and M&Ms and all that, but just, agriculture usually to have a civilization requires grains of some kind, right? Whether it's rice in Asia, corn over here in the Americas, or wheat and barley in the Middle East and Europe. You can tell because those are still sugars, right? Now, again, we're doing way too much sugar. I'm trying to wean myself off of all that. I got a wedding to go to in a couple months, so I gotta get sexier. But there's the sugar is, we've put, just understanding how much sugar we put in stuff is insane.
Yeah, it's startling. Yeah.
And like, even when we're not putting sugar into it, which we still are, but like breads, the fact that we don't take that, we take that outer husk off. It's like it's supposed to be there. That's the fiber that allows your body to process the sugars more, over a longer period of time. It doesn't give you that huge glucose spike, right? So it's one of those things where, like you said, there's no answers. There's only trade-offs, right? The problem is, I think we're coming to that point where we have accepted things and technology so quickly that we didn't understand what the trade-offs really were, because there wasn't the data for it. And let's be honest, the data was hidden from us by corporations and the government, specifically the government.
And Big Sugar in the 70s just killed us all.
Oh, yeah. Well, all of it did. This is probably this is a drug. Like, we don't think of it as a drug, but it is. Because all drugs do is get the brain to do something, right? Like, it isn't the aspirin that makes the pain go away. The aspirin triggers the brain to fire off other chemicals that helps suppress the pain. You can get, which is why they're doing a lot of work on light and sound therapies for not just like psychological traumas, but also just like, hey, are you in pain? Let's just get your brain and train your brain to not feel that pain, to release those chemicals automatically, or through light and sound instead of chemicals. This thing's a freaking drug, and they know it, and they've designed it to be that way. So you're getting that hit, that dopamine hit every time you flip on your, you flip to a new page.
One of my favorite quotes of recent years that I read was that future historians will look upon our culture and social media the way we look at the Roman Empire and lead pipes.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. That's
spot on.
Great.
Spot on.
What was that movie where they came back here and said like they didn't know any better? It was oh my god, I just watched it. I just watched Star Trek. The
Voyage Home.
The Search for Spock. No, it wasn't The Voyage Home. Oh man, they went back in time to here, and like everybody was just Well, I don't think it was The Voyage. I know they did that.
What did they say?
I know they did that in Voyage Home. I know that, but this movie they're like they were savage in this time, but they've gotten better. They'll get better. What movie was that? It wasn't a Star Trek movie.
Well, yeah. So the reason I'm thinking of The Voyage Home is because McCoy is in a hospital.
They did that in First Contact though too.
He gives them the cancer pill.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. It's all the same idea that we're again. What we think of as you go back 100 years, we would be shocked at the things that were considered medication back then. Like there were people who were drinking radium as medicine, heroin, mercury was, maybe not 100 years ago, but a little bit further back. Like we would be shocked. But again, like you said, 100, 1,000 years from now, people would be like, yo, we're doing what?
Yeah. It's one of those things where, people conflate. What am I trying to say? Because it's really easy to have this conversation and people think that you're trying to be regressive in some sense. And that's not at all what any of us are advocating for. There are good things to take from, there are good things we never should have gotten rid of and bad things that we're glad that we got rid of.
Yeah.
And it's the same mistake that, that people make with, technology and materialism. Jeff Kripal told me that one of his favorite jokes is, I have a refrigerator, therefore materialism is true. It's like it's not quite the same thing, but everything's low resolution now. People hear things and they take the low resolution interpretation.
Well, and I think that's a great point about low resolution, right? I mean, and I think this sort of ties into my earlier comment about how we've sort of pushed this idea of for the last century was, hey, don't talk about this stuff. It's all, it's all get rid of the supernatural. It was about removing the vocabulary, right?
Right.
Of this world, so that we didn't really, because if you don't, I'm a big believer in the Worf-Sapir hypothesis, that if you don't have a word for something, you don't understand it. That's a very dumbed down version of it, just for the people listening.
That's like the first grade hypothesis. Never mind. I'll keep going. Like if the first grader doesn't have a word for it, then it's not normal in your society.
Yeah. But so I think that was part of it. But yeah, to your point, I think that does lead to very low resolution conversations. And that's been by design. We don't want to have high resolution comments and conversation because it's hard, right? It's easier to go with slogans. But the problem is sometimes that nuance is what you need to solve the problem. And if you only have a low resolution version, you're never really going to solve the problem. And I think that gives a lot of people jobs.
So by design, as in shadowy cabal, by design, as in one person's idea that sort of spread and got grandfathered in, by design, meaning an epiphenomena. I mean, what are we talking about here?
Again, I tend to be very much an all of the above kind of person. Right. Well, because again, there's a lot of interlight. Again, I think a lot of this is starting again much higher than us, right? Like again, the spirits of the nations are a real thing. They have wills, they have desires, they have their own little plots and thoughts and plans that get filtered to us. However, to your point, I think a lot of it actually happens more out in public, where the intellectuals like to talk about things and it sort of stays up there, and they're like, well, it's the natural. Again, humans are not. We do the same thing every year because every 1,000 years or so, because we're stupid and that's how we are, right? We've never made a better human. We've just made humans that thought they were better than other humans. That's all we've ever been able to really do. So I do think are there some people who genuinely have thought this through? I'm certain there's a few, and I think they have those thoughts, they have those conversations. I think a lot of things are just cultural, right? And sort of they develop over time, a standalone complex, if you will, right? That humans are always going to default to the easiest solution anyway, and having a low resolution conversation is always easier then again, I don't think it's one or the other. I tend to think it's everything seems to be varying degrees of all of the above. It's just
path of least resistance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's an easy sell, right? So the spirits are like, well, why don't we just give them the easy sell, right? They're never going to go for the hard sell.
Right.
I'm kind of wondering how this will Well, I was thinking about the future of universal basic income after AI takes over as kind of like a distributive property of how this all turns out.
Soylent Green.
I've been playing around with some AI stuff, and it's still a lot of it is still pretty garbage. Like if you're using the internet, if you're using the internet as your data set, I'm sure that the models that you train on a specific amount of data can be a lot more useful. But like if you're going to that as the great oracle, like I'm just sort of like looking for leads on certain cases or something. Like that's the sort of thing that I use it for. It's sort of a more robust search engine. And almost every single thing that I get back is an hallucination.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just like, this is not great. This is not panacea.
Yeah. No, I've people have talked about that essentially ChatGPT will lie to you for as far as references. It's like
it's so eager to please.
Yeah, it's so eager to please. Well, and I think that I saw a thing a couple of weeks ago. I shared it with one of my kids who's looking at going to like higher technologies and all that. And it was a story of a guy who was doing. He was a computer programmer and he was in college, and this was a couple of years ago, apparently, early in AI. But he said the professor's point was that the Turing test is inherently flawed. And this, I swear this will all make sense in a second. His point was that the problem with the Turing test is it relies on us. And to prove his point, because it's about our interpretation of this thing being sentient and sapient. And so he takes out a pencil that he's glued googly eyes to. He says, this is Graphy. Graphy loves helping kids. He loves drawing with kids. He loves doing all kinds of things with kids, but the thing he loves most is helping children with their homework. And then the professor snaps the pencil in half, and half the room gasps because he just killed Graphy. And he said, and so his point was, it's not that AI is smart enough to trick us into thinking it's sentient. The problem is we're very, very bad at knowing what's real and what isn't.
We project and personify.
Correct. So in that regard, to your point, I'm not as afraid of AI in general. I think it's just a tool that, again, like any tool, can be used bad or can be used. I think a lot of people are the push to see it as a boogeyman. Not that it isn't a dangerous tool like that. Don't get me wrong. It is a very dangerous tool. Just like I would say it's as dangerous as a gun or a bomb. That having been said, I don't think it's the boogeyman that some people make it out to be. I do think it can be used very, very in a very dangerous way, though.
Well, and I think the foot is off the gas pedal a little bit after this dip in the stock market. I think a lot of that was the AI bubble popping.
Oh, it is. No, it absolutely is.
So that's gonna curb enthusiasm. Yeah,
I hadn't thought about that. It was the buzzword for a while. This has AI. This has AI.
A new technology. Every corporation overextends their investment in it, and then they are like, "Oh, this isn't developing as fast or doing the things we want it to."
Yeah.
Yeah. Why can't we get it to mow grass and like weld? I don't need it to do the art stuff.
Right.
I want it to do that shit so I can do this stuff. I can do the fun stuff.
I don't know. I kind of don't want it to weld so that people can have those jobs. But again, technology is what it is. But, so again, is it dangerous? Yes, I think it's potentially very, very dangerous as a tool. I do think we've over dramatized, like, oh no, AI is going to wake up and it's going to be Terminator 2. I'm just more worried about what people will do with that ability because again, it's a trite, or it's a trope now, but it sounds trite to say, but knowledge is power.
I mean, where I see it going is, we may get Skynet, but you're going to be able to shut it down by like presenting the liar's paradox or something. Like there's going to be some sort of form of philosophical or contradictory thinking, and it's just going to be like, I don't, yeah.
where I think the danger of AI is not in AI itself, but rather how the common man will rely on it to do our thinking. That's
Right.
where I'm worried.
Mhm.
That's where I'm legitimately worried about.
The person who doesn't chase down those hallucinations and just takes them at face value.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You got to double check it because it'll lie to you. Like you said earlier, I had to go through writing a description for a video. I'm like, that dude didn't do that. He goes, it said you're right. I'll take that out. I'm like, bitch, you're artificial. You're artificial intelligence.
I can't tell you how many times I've gotten an answer back and like tried to follow the threads, and I just end up typing "you're full of shit." And it's
exactly.
I'm so sorry I didn't do it. It's like I just.
Do y'all know who Robin Hanson is? Dr. Robin Hanson from George Mason. He talks about alien civilizations and well, he's been on Lex Friedman and whatnot. I had him on last week, and I had it right in his bio just for the heck. I mean, I'm just put it down here, 50 words, so I don't have to write it. And it said he worked in government explosives and built bombs with NASA. I'm like, no, he didn't. Where's that even at?
Yeah, I mean, there's reputational issues there too.
I'm more worried about the deep fakes and the fake videos that you can't tell the difference now if you just glance at them.
Yeah,
I mean, they don't have 10 fingers anymore. They got the fingers down pat.
Well, I still think that there is a segment of the population. I remember back, it's gotten much better, but there was even back in like the late 90s when people were using when CGI was really coming into its own. There were people who said it looked photoreal, and I was always like, I can kind of tell still when something the physics aren't quite right and stuff. And I think there's still a segment of people who have that canny eye, and they'll see a swirl or a certain gloss on some of these images, and you're like, it's not, you guys have got to be as tired of this as I am. Like, these Nephilim and giants, the old sepia toned photographs, and I see those all the time, and people,
like a 35-foot gorilla.
Like, this is little Bobby, and he's 10 years old, and his parents left him, and he carved this statue of Jesus out of a tree trunk using a toothpick, and it's like, that's not. We've seen those too, right? It's like it's always somebody standing beside this intricate carving, and it's like that's not a thing.
Well, and it's like we don't even have to go that far. I get pictures and videos sent all the time of stuff that was out of a movie, like the last Jurassic World Dominion. They did this sort of guerrilla advertising where they had people like using cell phones, quote unquote, and there's like, oh, look, there are these dinosaurs running around. Well, one of them was the mosasaur, and of course it was like supposed to be like the video from from some deep sea rig or whatever, right? And it goes by. Well, whoever had taken it before this person like cut it up a little bit so it looked like one of those cameras that takes like one frame every fraction of a second. Yeah, so it's not like time lapse, but it's not like it's not a smooth motion either, where it's like and so they did it with that, and they threw in some other stuff. He's like, dude, did you just see this video of this mosasaur? I didn't even have to look it up. I'm like, that's the mosasaur from Jurassic World. I am that nerd. I do know what that looks like.
There are some design choices with some of those Jurassic Park dinosaurs, like the flap of skin in the jaw of the T-Rex. Like, that's a dead giveaway that it's based off that. But here's the thing that annoys me with the sort of communities that we travel in is like I've run into so many paranormalists who are sort of wringing their hands about this, and I'm like, you guys should have never gotten excited over videos and photographs in the first place. Like, if you spend enough time in this and you're still excited by photographic or video evidence, audio is something different, because I think there's something about this, in the words of Timothy Renner, that we have permission to get audio for some reason. But like, if you're still like hoping to get a picture of these things, I think you're taking away the wrong message, and you really need to adjust your expectations, and you'll be a lot happier.
Especially with digital.
Yeah. So okay, finally we found something we can push back on. All right, throw out the Jello so we can wrestle.
Okay.
This is where I think you and I, and again, you and me and Dean, you and Dean are on that side. I'm over here on this side. I do think that there are material things out there that are what we could consider true cryptids. I think, however, the vast majority of material of things that are interacted with are not. They're paracryptid to a point, or they're paranormal exclusively. In fact, I think the vast majority of Bigfoot sightings are probably paranormal. It doesn't mean that there isn't a material. Now, again, this is where you can push back and say, well, hold on, maybe the material is the paranormal becoming physical temporarily, and that's what's interacting there. I'm a little more simple on that. I'm not saying that's not. I can clearly not say that's not the case, right? But we have enough accounts throughout history of things, that have been labeled as dragons or whatever, being killed, and they're in the records. There's enough evidence that is over and above what we usually see with the paranormal when it comes to Bigfoot, that I'm open to the idea that there is a physical, and unfortunately there's some stuff I can't talk about that really chaps my hide on this one, that there is a physical component to it. And I think because really I would suggest Bigfoot accounts tend to fall into two different categories, right? There's the, I was driving by or I was here and I saw this thing and it was, walked into it, did the, it was like deuces and left, right?
Yeah.
But then you have the stuff where it's like, well, then it follows me home, or it, kept calling my name. Like you have the clearly paranormal, or it's always in the yard, but there's never any physical evidence of it, right? There is clearly a paranormal aspect to it that is far greater than the actual material context. That would be my only point, is I do think there is some, for the physical, naturally occurring cryptids, I think that video and it's still interesting, it's still important. We just need a body, and unfortunately that's just where we are. But to your point, I think the broader material is paranormal, and in which case, yeah, you're right, that's not going to matter. Your camera doesn't matter. I
think I have a little bit more congruency with you on this than you realize. I think I still.
Dang it! I thought we were going
to
wrestle.
The only thing.
Change your mind right now, darn it.
The only thing that I really get up in arms on is when people say, there is no, there is nothing, there's no, people who report paranormal Bigfoot sightings are lying or hoaxing, and it can't be that. It's all noise in the data. Like that. When people say that, I'm like, okay, whatever. Your bias is showing.
Yeah.
It occurred to me that, if something like screen memories in the UFO domain are a thing.
Yeah.
Obviously the phenomenon loves appropriating flesh and blood animals.
Yes.
And sometimes those appropriated images do strange things that those animals don't do. A classic example is the 5 foot tall owl that Mike Clellan reported. There are no 5 foot tall owls. So similarly, there could be a pocket of these things that are alive out there. And that's sort of that the UFO phenomenon is appropriating, and that's have my cake and eat it too kind of scenario.
Yeah.
I would ask you to unpack your feelings on this sort of physical non-physical dichotomy, because I do feel a little bit more passionate about that.
Okay. Yeah. So I do think that the non-physical can become physical, like just straight up. I think if you think, I think that forget what I've experienced with people. Just classically, the overall, the simple fact of the matter is, every culture in the world has said, yeah, this non-physical thing can absolutely become physical. Interact with this. And
first ghost hunting tool was putting talcum powder on the floor and waiting for footprints.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I am very much of the idea that the non-physical, just because something is quote unquote non-physical, doesn't mean it stays non-physical, right? So let me state that at the outset, that is not really my argument.
Okay.
However, that being said, what I would say is there tends to be, with, again, some aspects of certain cryptids, a consistency of data that lends itself more to a living, breathing species. It's not just Bigfoot. There's other physical cryptids out there that, again, just seem to be, the data seems to be far more consistent than what we tend to see with the paranormal, right?
Orang Pendek would be my example.
Yeah, that's a great example of it. Or you know what? Yeah, pterosaurs. My favorite cryptid in the entire world is the Cadborosaurus, because it's the only cryptid that science is like, yeah, it's a real thing. because there was a skeleton of it. It was a sea serpent. We have the skeleton. Unfortunately, we don't have it to actually look at.
Was it a carcass or was it a skeleton?
It was a carcass, but basically,
right. But, the carcass had a skeleton in it, I guess.
What was it called? A Cadborosaurus?
Yeah, it's what leaves the
Caddy.
Caddy. It's what leaves the Cadbury eggs every year.
That thing from the
No, the filling inside the eggs is made of pureed Cadborosaurus.
Yeah, exactly. It is a typical sea serpent, but yeah, it was a mostly digested carcass. So a lot of what we see is the skeleton, but it was still basically held together. So yeah, carcass is a more accurate term. I appreciate that.
You're fine. I'm not trying to be a stickler here.
I was a stickler earlier. Look, technically right is the best kind of right. Is my view.
Okay.
But yeah, no. So there's again. That's my favorite one because it's something that science is like, yeah, this thing's real. Now, the problem is we don't really have them, but there's stuff that pops up every once in a while where it's like, if you have a small enough population of anything, it's going to stay hidden. It just can, right? And again, in the annals of Bigfootery, right? It's not just here, but again, like you said, during Pendek, in India, there was a British viceroy in India, I want to say in the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, who was touring India, and they came across two of what we would call Bigfoot. They were hairy hominids. They were about 6 feet tall. They were basically dehydrated. They nursed them back to health with some water, and he describes them in great detail. Mm-hmm. But essentially, they just got up and walked away. Once they had been sort of refreshed and cooled off, they took them under a tree and they started nursing them back to health for a little bit. Even here in America, there was a ape man in the 1800s that basically got injured near a train.
Just Jacko?
I think it's Jacko. Mm-hmm. It's been years since I've read it. I've just sort of moved on from it. But yeah, so there's enough accounts, and again, not just the footprints. There's stuff that Tex and them pulled out of Brown Springs. You're right. If we look at the annals of ghost hunting and all this other stuff, handprints and this stuff does pop up. It's just, however, that it doesn't tend to be as dramatic or consistent in size, textures, fingerprints, things like that. And that's why I tend to lean that there is at least a naturally occurring physical component to some of it, right? Definitely not all of it. And I'm not okay. So even I'm not even certain about the rock throwing. Let me throw that wrench out there for Bobby and the other Bigfooters out there. I'm not even sold that rock throwing is necessarily an indication that you're dealing with a Bigfoot, because how often? Yeah, poltergeist. They throw things. Poltergeists throw things all the time.
Oh, the entire subset of what the BFRO would call Class B reports, you could transpose to a house, and it would be poltergeist activity.
Yeah, yep, 100%.
I remember feeling when you told me about the Fae the first time. I was like, "What? That's the same thing."
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
it's the same phenomenon, word for word.
So, I'm going to needle you a little bit here, Jason.
Please do. We need to make it interesting.
You're citing, when you talk about the sort of detail inherent in some of these prints and whatnot, you're referring to things like mid-tarsal breaks and dermal ridges and very primatological things. I agree that there's a certain logic in assuming that something that is non-physical would not retain that level of verisimilitude. But is there anything...
I don't know what that means.
that something would appear that real or hew that closely to primate anatomy, but there's nothing really that says that something imaginal couldn't. A good example I would give would be someone, if we launched, over there on the shelf I have like an encyclopedic guide to Westeros, and if I launched that into space, it would be like, well, obviously no fictional world would have this much detail and this much history and this much, logic in terms of the way that power shifted and whatnot. So obviously it must be a real place. I'm being a little bit of a
I get it,
of a turd here, but you hope you take my but I hope you take my meaning. I mean,
I think it's a really, really good point, and this is where, like Dean would point out, that if something, imaginal or supernatural, I like the term supernatural because that's as close as I think we'll ever. They're all terms for things that we don't really understand to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
That if something supernatural becomes biological or becomes physical, it also is becoming biological. And let's use the Bible itself to point this out. Right when the three angels come and visit Abraham, he feeds them. Right, they eat and they are drinking,
Mm-hmm.
and again, what are we told? Some have entertained angels unaware. There is the implication in other texts as well that they are eating and drinking, they're interacting in a physical manner. Right now, let's take the idea of them being angels sort of to the side. That's at least evidence that if something supernatural becomes physical, it may not be like a hard light hologram, but rather a true biological entity.
Mm-hmm.
The existence of the Nephilim is evidence of that. I mean, if they can become physical, and procreate. I was about to go blue there for a second, and then clearly there's a biological reality to these things, and when they become physical. So I'm very, very sympathetic to that idea, particularly when it comes to something like Bigfoot, right?
Mm-hmm.
My argument, it's not necessarily against that. It just says it would be more along the lines of this. When we have physical, when physical evidence sort of occurs around the supernatural, it tends to be less consistent. It tends to be less, like we don't really have the same level and degree. Like we can map out, let's say the trackways, right? We can map out the trackways by size, and they form a bell curve, right? Which is indicative of there's some aspects of this that are just far more indicative of a naturally occurring biological entity rather than a purely or a supernatural one that's maybe becoming biological. But allow myself to be needled and say, but that doesn't mean that that's not what's happening, right? It could be that there is an aspect of this paranormal behavior that is simply that lends itself to be the data to be interpreted as physical when it's not. So again, I'm open to the needling because until a body shows up and it stays dead, we don't really know.
Nope. No, your Occam's razor has been sharpened very well in that regard with the bell curve. The first thing that popped into my mind with this ever increasing complexity that you allude to would be things like the channeled work of Patience Worth, if you put any stock in that. Like that's a pretty impressive corpus that has this level of detail and I mean, I don't think it's great. I've read some of it. It's hard to get through, but I get it. But something like that, or I'm also struck with something like whether or not you believe the story, Carrie Mullis's revelation of the PCR test from psychedelics, from LSD use. I mean, that obviously is very complex. I don't know the full nature of his insight. It might have been a very simple problem that he solved, but that still is a level of complexity that seems to be coming from this other side. So I'm still kind of hung up on the complexity issue. The bell curve aspect is interesting, and the incidence of Celtic toe is also interesting in Bigfoot reports.
Well, and again, we find what again are interpreted as kill sites. We have again, it's sort of the Occam's razor on this, but okay. So let me throw this in here because again, I don't put anything past the supernatural, right? I think it's not just demons over there, like you said. I love the title of your book. It's an ecology of souls. There's a whole ecosystem of supernatural entities with different levels of power and authority and intention and desires, and sometimes they just want to screw with us. So I'm open to that. I'm also very open to the idea that the biological aspect of this, of what that I am hypothesizing that exists for Bigfoot, because I'm not even saying I necessarily
Bigfoot's
believe
probably not even a good. It isn't a great
Yeah.
example of what you're what you're driving at. You know?
Right. Well, because again, something like but it's a great test. It's sort of a great test case because trust me, I'd like to just find one of the pterosaurs I saw and the other people have seen. Trust me,
Dude.
I think it's gonna be a lot easier to kill one of those than a Bigfoot. That's all I'm saying. But you know, this applies to what I and other people have seen as well. Is that if that biological entity is also connected to the supernatural, not that it dematerializes, but rather is perhaps in league or is a form of Nephilim in and of itself, right? The problem is, again, it may just be all of the above. I don't think again, my working hypothesis is that a true biological Bigfoot is not a Nephilim, but you know what? We ain't got the body. So I don't know. I can't say that definitively. In fact, I tend to think I have a little pet theory that I'm still sort of working on, that I wonder if the reason for the sort of Bigfoot explosion wasn't just because, hey, we happen to run across one, but because they have become a way of hiding Nephilim in broad daylight. Like, again, I think that it's not that there isn't a biological Bigfoot out there, but rather when people run across some of these, again, I think a lot of this is just straight up paranormal. End of conversation for me on that.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But I do wonder how often giants are sort of, once you slather the Bigfoot moniker on it, it sort of hides what its intentions are. And people don't, because if we again, the worst of fear hypothesis, if we can name it something that's friendly, then we tend to not question it as much.
It's precisely like the UFO answer, right? It's an it's an answer that you work backwards from.
Yeah.
So the only question that remains is a binary one, right?
Yeah.
Does it exist or not? As opposed to true interrogation of all the possibilities, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, again, so here's a question. What does it even mean to be real? Yeah, I know. Someone's pull out the bong. It's gonna be fun now. Like, that's that conversation you have at 3 a.m.
Let me get my Bernardo Kastrup off the wall, and we'll just have a fun time.
You're getting into simulation theory now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't want to go too far afield into that, but it's,
it's way too late in the conversation to start.
Yeah.
to start on that. But yeah, I mean, so again, I'm open to the idea that a lot of this stuff, that even the supernatural stuff, it does become, in fact, I'm going to just flat out say it does become physical in some way.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that there are the existence of biological entities as well. I think it's, again, I tend to be more all of the above rather than either or in a lot of these matters, just because the data set indicates both can be active.
Well, and I appreciate that we're in a space where we can sort of entertain that nuance, because you do run into these people who, I mean, none of these ologies should be ologies, really. I mean, like, they're not ologies, they're like fan clubs.
That is yes.
And you get
you're right on that.
I mean, not all cryptids are created equal, you know what I mean?
Some are more equal than others.
And like, but you do run into these people, again, it's the low resolution problem, who are like, oh, I can't wait to find the Mothman egg. And it's like
yeah,
no, you're not going to find that. Like,
it's not that kind of party.
Well, yeah, it's not that kind of party. I like that.
I like that. Well, that's okay. So let me throw a little personal story in there for you on that one. I get people talking to me about pterosaurs all the time, and they'll say, well, I think one's nesting over here. And I'm like, here's my problem. If they were nesting, I think we would have found them, right? It's, again, I think they are real. I think there's a ton of reason as to why. I think I'm going to reissue a booklet on it that I wrote years ago. I pulled it down just because I didn't like the way it looked. But there's reason to think that they are real and physical creatures. However, I think they behave. I think the data would indicate they behave more like sea turtles, right? They're reptiles. They're not going to make a nest like a bird, right? So to your point, there's this this
Interesting.
It's not just that, hey, let's get rid of all the strange stuff that we don't like, and let's just make everything physical. It's also in this fan club thing, there isn't the discipline to stop and say, hey, let's maybe look at this from a broader angle and ask some more probing questions about what's being observed, because maybe our assumptions are on the base level are wrong, right? They say, well, it's pterosaur, it flies, it must be like a bird. And that's not a good analog to it, right? So I think the problem is, because this is all of these are fringe topics. The problem is the people who have sort of had that better, a higher training of the that sort of discipline aren't necessarily always interacting with it to have those conversations and say, well, let's rethink this.
And the other thing that strikes me constantly is that, and this is going to sound kind of gatekeeper-ish and snobbish, but
go for it, please. We're all friends here.
People who are into cryptozoology just read cryptozoology books, or nowadays they just watch cryptozoology videos. They might make brief forays into zoology, but they never just pick up a book on something different. There's never a they never have. I think to truly make connections in this field, you need to find yourself drawn to a book on plumbing in ancient China, or Indo-European horse sacrifice, or something. These things that and then after you've built your knowledge set of what the literature says on these topics that you love, and you've got a good idea of a lot of the cases and a lot of the trends, then you go to these other spaces and you actually find something that is that has something to do with this. And that happens more often in the UFO field than it does the cryptozoology field. But
Faithful Executioner book I did a podcast on.
Wait, who is this?
It's about the life and times of an executioner in the Dark Ages.
Nice.
Oh, interesting.
Remember how I was telling you I was trying to expand my niche to... that's what you were describing is what I'm turning my podcast into. I'm tired of talking about just one thing.
That's a perfect
It's working
example.
out.
And dimes to donuts, you're going to find that everything else speaks to this.
It's all related in some way.
Well, I don't know what I was trying to emphasize in that regard. Oh yeah, just in terms of people go deep on this thing and then go broad.
Yeah.
My niche is everything like a red conspiracy line that goes to everything that could possibly be involved. That's my podcast niche.
Yeah, that's
I have a lot of paleontologists on.
Yeah. Well, and you should. I mean, let me use this as a metaphor. I do I'm really going to be focusing a lot more on my comic work moving forward. I've got other non-comic related books coming at, that I'm working on.
I thought you meant you were about to do a top 5 real quick. What a great audience.
Yeah, no. But comic books, so I'm working on that a little bit more. So and one of the things I've noticed, I've talked about for a long time in sort of the art space, is you look at the first generation of comic artists, they didn't know what they were doing. It was a brand new medium. And then you have someone like Will Eisner show up and literally write the book on how to do this kind of thing. And for the first 2 or 3 generations, these are artists, right? They went and they learned how to do art. They weren't learning to do comic books. They were learning to do art. And essentially they fell into doing comics because it paid the bills, right? Then you get really generation 3, where you start getting your Neil Adams, right? And your Frank Millers. These are people who went to school to learn how to do art, but they loved comics and they wanted to get into comics. So they still had a broader art training. A lot of these authors, a lot of the people who are writing wanted to be writers, and they had these sort of broader training, which is why they were writing all these interesting stories. Regardless of what you think about Stan Lee, the man could write a lot of different things. Chris Claremont, same way. But then you get into the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and post that, what you start getting are people who only wanted to do comics. They didn't get a broader education. And the quality of comics has really fallen post early 90s. Again, not judging any one person per se, but just saying it's very quick you can sort of see the broader themes. It's like, okay, we're sort of going back, because the sort of like the earlier point about AI art, it's actually sort of regurgitating it's eating its own excrement to a point. And so because of that lack of broader understanding of broader encounters, the quality starts dropping. In the same way, to your point, I think it's very well taken. A lot of it's cryptozoology, and to a point even ufology as well. A lot of people, that's their only point of contact, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not checking into folklore, and
yeah.
and they're not or they're only looking at the stuff that makes them happy. They're removing the data sets they don't like.
Yeah,
right.
It just occurred to me, if you want to draw a parallel, and this is incredibly reductive. I'm not meaning this literally, but figuratively, I think it's true. Like, a cryptozoologist shouldn't read zoology books, and ufologists shouldn't read astronomy books. Like those are the wrong places to look, Yeah.
Yep. But
for me,
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying, and it's there needs to be a broader. There's a broader education that does come. Like, I'm not. Hey, if it's got a white lab coat, he must know what he's saying, right? Believe me, that ain't my shtick, right?
Right.
But I do think there is importance in doing academic work. One of the most important things I ever did was in one of my archaeology classes. It was the lab work for one of the semesters, and literally for half a semester we wrote one paper. It was he called it the bottle paper, and the point was, how do you describe a bottle? Now that sounds stupidly mundane, and just and very easy, right? It's like, oh, it's like, not when you really look at it. You say, hey, look at all these things that we would call bottles. Well, how do you describe that so that these all get classified as bottles? And by the way, should they be classified as bottles? And the exercise is to get you to really think about, well, maybe there's more than one way to skin a cat sometimes. And if these are all bottles, then what makes them a bottle? That's a much more difficult conversation to have sometimes. And if you've never had to do something like that, to understand the nuance of a situation, right?
God. I'm just in my mind. Sorry, I'm thinking out loud how to describe it. Like, when does a bottle become a jar? When is it a vase?
Yeah. No, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, when is it a jug?
Yeah. Oh gosh. When's a bottle become a jug?
I mean, this is where the conversation starts getting really French, right? I mean,
I like that.
I mean, I just read some Bruno Latour last night, and it's like, this is where we are now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When does the bottle become a jug?
But that's very Sapir Whorfian of you too, to sort of.
Thank you.
To have taken that angle.
Well, it's so for me, I think the point is there is a discipline in academia that is needed in these fields. But the problem is
academia won't let the discipline happen. Is one problem.
Well, true.
I mean, this is a conversation that I plan on expanding on in my new project, which I should probably plug here in a little bit, because I should probably leave here in a little bit because I'm starting to fade.
Yeah, let us know if you get tired. I'm not going to stop the train that's rolling.
That's all right. I should probably jet in about 10 minutes. But
you're good. But
academia is opening up to UFOs. I think that's very clear.
Mm-hmm.
The question is it the UFO? What version of the UFO is it? Right?
Yeah.
The analogy that I always use is, like, you remember when you used to go into hotel rooms and over the toilet there'd be the little strip of paper that says "sanitized for your protection."
Yes,
it's like that version. It's like that version of the UFO.
Just the saucer.
Right. And I don't think that you can. Again, this sounds like I'm being kind of a gatekeeper again, right? But I'm not sure that you can truly grasp the UFO unless you're wading into those. Unless you embrace the seaminess of it,
Yeah.
I mean, like, I used to check out UFO books from my school library, and it felt like just secondary to checking out a porno mag or something. Like, it had that sort of like, should I even be touching this kind of vibe?
We did not go to the same library.
Well, I didn't say they were. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I get. Yeah.
I got you, man.
And what I guess you think about. I think about ufology, and I think about as was quoted in Mirage Men, these sort of like dingy subterranean conference rooms at a Ramada Inn,
Yeah.
And I think you have to wade through the swamp of Tim Beckley and Jim Moseley, and even though I wouldn't necessarily call him a swamp creature in that sense, John Keel, like you have to go through this sensationalist version of ufology, of the UFO history, before I think you really get at how anti-structural, how oppositionally positioned towards understanding this thing can be.
Yeah.
And that's not what academia is doing. Like I'm reading papers, and it's like there's no lit review there.
Yeah.
Well,
and so let me again go back. Like I said, I'm certainly not a gatekeeper. I think we need everyone out there doing their best work. My point is, in the same way that Christianity, in America, sort of rejected. There's sort of there was, particularly in like the Baptist traditions and the evangelical traditions, sort of an anti-intellectualism that exists, right? So there's an which led itself to not having conversations about the supernatural in that same way. A lot of cryptozoology in general, and has this sort of very narrow view on it, and everyone's coming at it from their narrow view instead of saying, well, hold on, let's see where the data actually takes us. Let's just see what all the data is. And let's look outside of the data that we have, and let's look at some of these other things. Like you said, once you start comparing folklores, and you start noticing themes that shouldn't be there if these things were if they were purely materialistic, right? There are aspects of these things that pop up, and the problem is a lot of people don't want to have that conversation. They don't want to have that. There is a value to having that sort of academic discipline that needs to be embraced, and I think is being embraced by many, though it's still the minority.
Well, I've noticed
still drastically the minority.
This is particularly virulent, though, in cryptozoology, where I've offered my opinion, and the first thing that people say is like, well, how many times have you seen Bigfoot? Because I go back on the back 10 acres of my property, and I see him every other weekend, so you don't know anything about it. And, I've had this blog post, if I ever write another blog post in my life, I've had this blog post idea for a while that's basically fire all the astronomers. Because apparently we don't need people back on Earth in the chair doing the data crunching, looking into all this stuff, thinking about this stuff. Only the astronauts matter. So fire all the astrologers. And I think there's a place, and what really the crux of that is like you need the astronomers and the astronauts because they're going to have different opinions, different insights, and both camps should listen to each other.
Yeah.
So, the armchair folklorist, like, is what I tend to be. I've been doing, I've done more field research in the past 18 months than I ever have in my life. But the armchair researchers should command their own type of respect, just as the people who have field experience should as well.
Yeah.
Nobody wants Bigfoot not to be real than the people that think Bigfoot are real. They hate the camps just hate each other. I'm like, y'all calm down.
And this is George P. Hansen territory, right? Like it's baked into the cake that people will fight over this because it's an anti-structural thing that people are looking at.
Yeah. And to your point about the whole UFO conversation, just to make it even messier, and I think this is, again, I don't think that there's a government agent behind every tree, right? But it's not just... Yeah, exactly. That's what they want. Exactly. That's what they want you to think. But it's like, even if you're dealing with the UFO, it's like, okay, well, we have to at least not just look at the phenomena, but also say, well, where is the phenomena? Where has it been manipulated or faked?
Right.
By the United States government, and at what times? That's until you're willing to have that conversation. You're only looking at maybe even if you are taking those deeper dives, those Keelian dives, and those things, you may only be looking at half the story here.
Well, and the only sensible thing to do is to throw up your arms and walk away from it because there's too much noise in the signal.
Yeah.
And I think it's partially for the reasons that you mentioned, and partially for the reasons that I mentioned, that this is just a noisy signal in the first place.
Yeah.
But I'm on this line of thought now, this line of inspiration. Maybe this is a good place to close it. It's probably a little bit too touchy-feely, but
put a pin in it.
I feel like a lot of this stuff has to be felt, like in a gut way, more than it has to be deduced. Just and part of feeling it in that regard means that you don't make any strong claims about it. That's part of what feeling it means.
That's what gives them ammo to come back against you too. If you start making claims,
right?
They can't debunk if you're not bunking.
Yeah, exactly.
There's no
bunk.
You can't debunk if you ain't bunking.
All right, guys.
Let me throw my pin in here, and I let me agree with Josh's point. I'll just go ahead and say this little thing. Human knowledge is a chain, and there's a link to every chain. It may be that the ultimate goal of all of this isn't coming to an answer per se, but rather wrestling with it. Right? If we see, again, what does Israel mean? Those who wrestle with God. Ultimately, again, I don't care what Bigfoot is. I'm wrestling with the material. We wrestle with God in our own ways, right? And it may not matter that we come to a conclusion on any of this, but rather that we have forged a link in a chain that will go on for as long as humans are here. Again, that may be shorter than we would like, but we're just participating in this longer story, and maybe that's the only point that really matters, is that we've participated and that we've formed a base for something that will continue into the future. And maybe there are no real answers beyond God's real, he loves you, and you may want to get to looking in on that one.
Co-signed on every level.
Oh yeah,
co-signed on every level.
"Quote unquote" Jason McLean, 2024.
Gentlemen, this was, I don't know what I was expecting tonight, but this was a hell of a lot of fun. So
I needed it in my life so bad. I'm like, I was like, I don't want to talk about the questions I have. Fuck those questions. I don't need what you wrote me.
I was actually going to do other things, and when Bob was like, "So I've got Joshua Cutchin coming out," I'm like, "Well, okay, shit, I got to do this.
Yeah,
I got to be there."
I don't know how I knew you two were friends, but apparently I just knew it. So I'm like, okay,
I'd say we're acquaintances. I don't know that we're friends.
But this is the kind of conversation that. So I got up at 6 this morning to do some work because I just transitioned to being a full-time author and musician. So that's a little bit of a celebratory thing, but it also means that sometimes you got to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning if you want to get stuff done and be a dad, right?
Oh yeah. Trust me.
And so like when you have an 8 o'clock p.m. podcast after getting up at 6, it's kind of like, do I really want to? But this was. Yeah. I rarely get to have conversations like this, and
this is what my podcast is.
Thanks to both of you. I mean, I sincerely appreciate it.
I'm not going to shiver and ask about your research assignment. When's the last time you saw something?
Yeah, thank you for coming on. And thank you, Bob, for having me.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It was like, shit, I gotta talk to Josh. Which reminds me, at some point in the near future, I need to do an interview with you off. It'll be recorded. That book that I interviewed you for like over a year ago.
Yeah.
That whole thing, I'll tell you later because you got to go. That whole thing sort of fell apart, and it's coming back to sort of like the original version of it.
Okay.
But I'll be doing a different interview with you on that one. It'll be fun. But yeah, as soon as he said you were coming on, I'm like, oh shit, I'd love to talk to Josh. I mean,
well, you both know where to find me. So
all right, you want to plug your books coming up, Josh? Just they're going to be in the description.
Yeah, I'm working on I'm literally working on 4 or 5 new projects right now in different. There's an audiobook of my novel "Them Old Ways Never Died" that's being worked on, being narrated by Micah Hanks, which is a perfect fit.
Nice.
I'm working on a project with my good friend Barbara Fisher about anomalous light phenomena. I just started my next solo book that hopefully will be out next year about fictional incursions into reality and what they say about the UFO phenomenon. And but that's part of the reason that I was going so hard on you, Jason.
Yep.
And then I'm also working on, I guess maybe this is the first place I can announce this because it actually feels like it's coming together. I'm working on a documentary series. So
excellent.
Updates for all those things, joshuacutchin.com, JOSHUACUTCHIN.com.
All right. And they're in the description. It will be in the future. All right, fellas.
Thanks so
Have
much,
a good
gentlemen.
night. And
you all too.
thanks for the
Bye.
great time, because that was amazing.
This was fantastic. Thanks, y'all.
I needed it. Peace.
Bye.
I never didn't believe in Bigfoot. I never believed in it. I didn't believe in it. I never gave it any thought.
They kept wood knocking back and forth to each other, and it was in a pattern.
Barn owls don't typically throw rocks.
I come across these tracks.
Sasquatch is still not on my mind.